And some of my friends and family who don't, really know what contemporary philosophers do, when I had said that I worked on this, they would sort of ask me for like what are sort of like comforting aphorisms I'd have about death. And to their surprise, the answer is no, it's bad. It's bad for you, and you should feel bad about it. It's sort of depressing, but I'm after the truth, not after things that'll make you feel good.
Yeah.
But the
I
other thing
already
is,
knew that. I already knew that.
yeah, they already knew
What the
that.
hell do I need a philosopher for?
Absolutely. It's a derelict of
I've got a
duty.
deductive proof for you. If there was any doubt,
Yeah.
now I can erase that.
Professor Timmerman, may we call you Travis? Excellent. So the reason Travis is with us today is that he has some ideas about the badness of death. So we think death is bad, but what exactly is so bad about it? Because either perhaps we go to heaven, or it's nothing at all. It's an experiential blank. And how can that be bad for us? We're not in pain. We don't even have any regrets anymore. So how in the whole world can death really be so bad?
Yes. Well, here's something that you probably didn't expect me to say. If we go to heaven and heaven contains some amount of intrinsic bad that's outweighed by intrinsic good, but that continues indefinitely, then we would have an infinite amount of intrinsic good and bad, which I think would make the overall value of our life undefined. In order for our life to be good, I think we need more good than bad. So if we go to heaven and there's only goodness in our lives and absolutely no more badness, and all the badness was the finite amount confined to the actual world, then that would not be bad for us. Right? I'm more interested in the question of whether the experiential blank, so to speak, was bad for us. So suppose that we don't suffer just a mere bodily death, but the death of the person, whatever it is that constitutes us, even if it's an immaterial soul. I'll use a term to refer to the event that makes us go out of existence permanently. Could that be bad? Well, I think I'm here to defend the common sense view that yes, it is, and it can be fitting to feel bad about that as well. It's not bad in and of itself. I think, like most people who specialize in this area, most philosophers, that it's bad because of the good that death makes you miss out on. And it's the good things that you would get had you not died. Death deprives you of those goods. So just like if somebody stole concert tickets from me, this has been an example Ben Bradley gives, that prevents me from going and having an enjoyable experience at a concert, that makes my life worse. Even if I'm none the wiser. The event of death can prevent me from missing out on many additional good experiences. And that makes my life worse overall too. And that's bad for me.
Something can be in itself quite pleasurable and good, but it can still be bad compared to what you're missing out on, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, so if instead of going to the concert, which is what I would have done by hypothesis had somebody not taken tickets from me, I go do something else that I would enjoy. Let's say see a movie. I like movies, or watch Severance. I enjoy Severance very much, but suppose I'd enjoy it slightly less than the concert. Having those tickets stolen from me was still bad for me because it made me worse off than I would be had they not been stolen.
I use an example of a man who's he has this wonderful nap, but he's missing his own wedding. So the nap was fantastic, but he missed his own wedding, which would have been so much better. So the nap was a terrible thing.
Yes, right. So far you're sounding like an echo of Patrick.
Oh yeah, but there are some differences here for sure. That I think we're going to learn a lot here. So
yeah, I think the basic framework is something that's widely accepted by people who think that death is bad, and then the devil's in the details, so to speak.
Exactly. So we all here, we say, okay, we're agnostic about the afterlife. We're putting that aside, and we're saying, okay, let's just assume that death is the end. We are talking about death as the final end. That's it, right? The show is over. Is that bad? And then someone might say, well, it's not really bad because you're not suffering when it's over. And you're not even regretting it. And you don't even know what you're missing out on. So how in the whole world could that be bad for you? And then you are saying, well, it can still be bad because if you hadn't died, you would have experienced these other good things in your life. Or if that's true, if it's true that you would have experienced other good things in life, if you hadn't died, then death is bad for you. And so that's known as the deprivation account. And so now you also have a kind of way of forcing this conclusion on the Epicurean. So who are the Epicureans, and why don't they buy the deprivation account, and how do we force them to accept it?
Yeah, sure. So Epicureans think that death cannot be bad for the person who dies, and there's two general arguments that I think are discussed widely in the contemporary literature. So one you've already alluded to, which is what's sometimes called the timing argument. If I permanently cease to exist once I die, we can ask the question, if that was bad for me, when is it bad for me? It seems odd to say that it's bad for me once I no longer exist. You might think plausibly nothing is good or bad for me when I don't exist. And it's odd to say that it's bad for me before it happened, because nothing seems to be good or bad for you before it happens, at least in paradigmatic cases of things that are bad for you. So you might infer that there's no time that it's bad for you, and if there's no time that it's bad for you, it's not. The other kind of popular Epicurean argument is known as the asymmetry argument, which is we don't seem to think that it's bad for us to not have come into existence earlier than we did, even if we think that it's bad for us to not die later than we will. And the challenge is to say what the relevant difference is between these two periods of non-existence, the one that preceded you coming into this world and the one that comes after you going out of this world. Okay. So one thing that I say to Epicureans is that these are clever and interesting arguments. But I think they're going to fall onto one of two horns. They're either going to have to say the same thing that the deprivationist, like myself, is saying, but using different terms, or they're going to have to commit to a paradigmatically irrational view about what's prudent to do. Okay, so that's abstract, but I think a case can sort of help illustrate what I take to be the fundamental issue. So suppose that you are in a convenience store and the hitman from the film No Country for Old Men comes over and he tells you can do one of two things. Rather than flipping a coin, he's feeling happy and he's going to give you a choice. You can either take a sack with millions of dollars that you could go on and use to, let's say, live a life that would be good by whatever your favorite account of well-being is. All right. Doesn't have to be hedonism. You accomplish stuff, you have your desires satisfied, you have friends, you make the world better, you live a meaningful life. Whatever you think makes the world good, you get to do that with the money by stipulation. Or he can quickly and painlessly kill you. Okay. I think anybody, whether they're an Epicurean or not, is going to have to say, very plausibly, that the thing that you have self-regarding reason to do is to take the money and live the longer, happier, better life. And that you have self-regarding reason not to end your life prematurely when the alternative is a life that would be, by everybody's lights, better for you. Longer, happier lives are better for you than shorter, less happy lives. Okay. Now, if the Epicurean says, no, you could do either choice, there's no difference in your interest because it's not bad for you to end your life right now or have your life ended right now. I think that's just utterly absurd. And it has to deny very plausible axioms about the relationship between events and its effects on your overall well-being. In other words, you have to say, okay, if the choice where you die makes you go out of existence and live a life that's shorter and less good for you, that's not actually overall bad for you. That just seems, or that's not against your self-regarding interest. That just seems utterly absurd to me. It violates what should be very basic, fundamental axioms of well-being. On the other hand, if they say, well, no, you should, of course, take the money, not because death would be bad for you, but for some other reason. And this is where most Epicureans go. They'll say something like, well, it's not bad for you to be killed, but it does mean your life is less good. Okay. Or it's not bad for you, it's bad to you. Or we'll draw distinctions between subjective and objective bads, or intrinsic and extrinsic bads. Okay. There's a bunch of different ways that they can go. Any way that they go to preserve the, I think, unquestionably true judgment that the self-regarding interested thing to do is to live a longer, happier life, that is going to be deprivationism by any other name. So take David Hirschenoff, who's an Epicurean. He'll say, death isn't bad for you, but it can result in less good. And avoiding having less rather than more good is prudentially relevant. I think, okay, that's right. But now, David Hirschenoff and I are not disagreeing about substantive philosophical claims. We are disagreeing about the extension of the use of bad for. So we agree about like what the effects of the event on your overall well-being. We agree about what sorts of reasons, prudential and moral, that grounds in various cases. We agree about what sorts of choices you should make in every possible case. We agree about all of that. He's just using the term bad for to pick out events that include intrinsic badness and range over a much more narrow range of events than I use the term for. But I don't think that's a substantive disagreement beyond this linguistic dispute about what the correct use of the term is.
If I may, just to see if I get your argument correctly, if I may recapitulate it. So you are saying, look, we have a judgment about what's reasonable for someone to do in a certain situation. And so a situation, for example, where you can either be killed quickly and painlessly, or you can receive some benefit, you can get well-being. So if you look at those two life trajectories, you can see that one life, the one where you are not killed painlessly, contains more well-being, if we say the measure is going to be well-being, right? So it would look from a common sense point of view that you have a reason to not want to die and a reason to want to continue. Is that correct? And so if the Epicurean says, no, you have absolutely no reason to prefer a life with more well-being that's longer than a life that just abruptly ends here and now, right? Then that's unpalatable. Is that what you're saying? That it's just too unintuitive and it goes against how we normally think what we have reasons to do?
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think I want to make maybe even a slightly stronger claim than that, which is not just that it's unintuitive, but it seems to violate a very plausible axiom that a life that's longer contains more well-being is better for you than one that's shorter and contains less well-being. I mean, it's just not even clear to me that that's coherent to say so much as just counterintuitive. I'm not sure how to have what philosophers sometimes refer to as an axiology to make sense of those claims.
So you're saying if you are somebody like a Epicurean, which is some kind of, you could say their value theory is close to what a utilitarian would have today, some sort of utilitarian. You say, well, well-being is everything. And then you're still denying that it would be better for you to continue living and have more well-being than to painlessly and abruptly be killed.
Yes, yeah. I want to avoid technically begging the question against them by using the term better, but that it would be in your self-interest or overall you would be better off if you do that because you'd have a higher total well-being. And that gives you what I use the term self-regarding reason to just try to avoid begging the questions about how to correctly use the phrase better for or worse for. But yeah, that's right. And if they say no, that doesn't give you any sort of self-regard and reason. You don't have any self-regard and reason to have a life that contains more rather than less well-being. I'm not sure that that's even a coherent claim to make. It's just by definition, having a life with more total well-being is better than a life that contains less total well-being.
I mean, it would seem that a coherent welfarist of any stripe should prefer the longer life with more more happiness and well-being in it than a short life with less. It's
at least prudentially, maybe not morally, but prudentially.
Yeah, prudentially. But that's all you're talking about right now. You're looking at a kind of self-regarding reason. That's what you call it. Now, we're not at all. You are not at all guilty of straw manning the Epicureans here, because there is. I was looking at the ancient texts, and I looked at Lucretius, and he has an example that struck me so much. I just was baffled, and that is, I don't know if you remember this one. He has the example of the husband who is longing to see his wife and his children, to hug them and kiss them, right? And he says, well, if you would die now, it's just as good, basically, because then your desires to see them also perish with you, right? So he is literally saying that it's not really, you don't have that much reason to prefer the one over the other.
And interestingly, Lucretius, in his epic poem, says, you should wish to remain in life so long as the caresses of pleasure hold you there. And that passage comes near another passage where he's talking about people who are looking at corpses, and they see sort of like rotting flesh and maggots in them, and they feel a sense of disgust, and they're sort of imposing a negative experience on that. So I'm not a historian, so I can't read those texts in their original language, so I'm hesitant to weigh in on the correct interpretation. But I think there's a good case to be made that Epicurus himself might bite the bullet on the case that I give, whereas Lucretius could be read, perhaps plausibly, as saying that death is not intrinsically bad for the person that dies, and that maybe it doesn't warrant the same types of negative attitudes that we would, that we're disposed to impose on that. So I think there's room for saying that historic figures could go down in different ways on the dilemma. Although most contemporary philosophers working today, although not all of them, but most working today, I think try to accommodate the judgments about what's prudent to do at the expense of perhaps just ultimately agreeing with us about whether deprivationism is true.
The problem is that once you start to think that you have a reason to continue living, and you have a reason, then you have a reason to not want to die, and then from there you seem to say, well, look, you are saying, well, when we talk about what we have reason to do, etc., that's very much connected to what is good and bad, and so a negative evaluation follows. Negative evaluation of death follows when you have a reason to see your family rather than not. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. So imagine that Epicurus, the person that he's speaking to, has the ability to continue living and go see their family and have their desire satisfied. Would that be good for them? Seems like yes, even on their view, because then you're getting hedonic well-being that adds to the total that you've accrued over the course of your life. And then if you continue living, you don't get to do that. It seems like you have less hedonic well-being. And then if you have the option of a third option of just not doing it because you got out of existence, you still accrue the same lesser amount of total hedonic well-being. So I think it's very hard to even make sense of the idea that an option where you go out of existence and have less goodness overall in your life is prudentially on a par with one where you continue existing and have more total net good in your life.
I mean, the way you describe the way they're trying to, let's say, both avoid the that death is bad for you, but also want to be able to counsel somebody to not choose death, but to choose the money and the well-being, or seeing your family, etc., it always collapses their view into becoming, in the essence, indistinguishable from the deprivation account, right? So one of them was, he says, well, the death is bad. It's not bad. It's not a harm to you, but it's a harm for you, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Although I should say that, so that was James Stacey Taylor. And when I wrote that paper and published it, like, he does make that distinction, and I took that to be the charitable way to interpret how that distinction was parsed out. But I had the pleasure of debating him at the University of Delaware a few months ago. And it turns out that he, at least now, wants to go the other way on the two-horn dilemma, on the dilemma that I give him. So yeah, he personally thinks both of those would be prudentially on a par. That is, painlessly dying right now or continuing to live where you have more total well-being. He thinks it doesn't matter prudentially if the thing that causes you to have less total well-being is death. But it would matter prudentially if the thing that causes you to have less well-being doesn't make you go out of existence. So he does draw that distinction, and I think if he uses that distinction in that way that I took him to be using it, he'd be saying the same thing as me. He agrees about that, but says I'm not going to apply the distinction in that way to adjudicate matters of prudence. I'm going to just bite the bullet the other way and say it's prudentially on a par to just die and go out of existence.
I mean, that's really amazing, because, I mean, imagine you're, somebody actually asking you for advice, and you go to this philosopher and you say, what should I do? I have this, I have this choice forced on me. I can either be killed painlessly, or I can receive all this money. What should I do? Right. And then a philosopher like the one we're discussing now would say, well, it's just flip a coin. What can I say? Where right. We, sensible philosophers, would say, take the money, take the long life, and there's a very simple reason for it, and that is, if you compare those two lives, one of them has more good stuff in it, the one that's longer, because that we've stipulated that in this case.
Right. I think it's worse than that. So before I even make it harder for James, I'll preface it with, like, brilliant philosopher, wonderful guy. I love him. He's a good friend. But I think his view runs into even deeper problems when you go that route. So, one thing that he can try to say in response to the example that you gave is, well, in typical cases, even if it's not bad for you, you have friends and family who love you, and it'll be bad for them because they'll continue living and they'll be sad that you chose death or something along those lines. Now, that doesn't help more refined cases where there's hermits or stuff. But here's a case that I think is a big problem for him. It's a fantastical case. That is, I mean, it's out there. I'm not sure, but I still think it's informative about the plausibility of the view. So plausibly, if you could prevent beings from having lives that are overall bad for them by preventing them from coming to existence without hurting anybody, without doing anything that's bad for anybody, you should do that. Right? So if you know that some being's going to come into existence in the future and it would have a life that's so terrible as to not be worth living, and you could stop it from coming into existence, it seems like you can have a moral obligation to do that under certain circumstances, maybe where you're not hurting anybody else. Now, suppose that you have the nuclear codes because our current president is a madman. He shows you that our little nuclear football and says, if you push this button, we'll send off enough nukes, we'll just kill all life on Earth instantly. Okay, well, so one thing that you would do is prevent future beings from coming into existence who would have net negative lives, because very plausibly there's going to be many of them. Not just humans, but non-human animals. Wild animal suffering is terrible. Animals in industrial farms live lives that I think are very plausibly, on the whole, bad for them. You'd prevent that from happening. On the other hand, you'll end the lives of many people who are having positive lives right now. But on James' view, that's just not bad for them at all, even though he agrees with me that if they continued living, their lives would contain more overall good. But he says it's not bad for them in a way that's, not only is it not bad for them, it just prudentially is on a par with going out of existence right now. So I don't see, if you accept the claim about having a moral obligation to prevent beings from coming into existence that have net negative lives, and accept the claim that it's not prudentially bad at all, not prudentially relevant at all to end people's lives who would otherwise continue to have net positive life, then it seems like you could generate an obligation to just destroy the entire world. Even if, by hypothesis, the future world would contain more overall good life than bad life. You could make it as good as you want if there's just one little being that's going to have one slightly bad life, and many that would have had good lives. You still could get the conclusion that you'd be obligated to do that. I find that hard to believe.
Well, I think the problem for him is he can't explain why they would be harmed. I mean, if for him death is not a harm to the individual, then you are not harming anyone by merely killing them. So,
right.
Which
you're not harming them in any or doing anything that matters at all prudentially.
And the deprivation view is good because it can explain why killing somebody is harming them. And it can also explain why mercy killing can be justified because you're preventing harm to them. And that's the other side of your argument.
Right. I think that's a very important point. My students, when I teach philosophy of death, seem much more willing to bite the bullet on cases where you miss out on additional good life. But they have a much harder time biting the bullet on cases where you prevent somebody from having continued life that would be on the whole bad. So many people have had companion animals, dogs, cats, little rodents that they love, and their quality of life will often deteriorate to the point at which, very plausibly, if they continue living, it would not be good for them. The intrinsic badness would outweigh the intrinsic goodness every day. I had 2 dogs that I loved, and we had to take one of them to the vet to be killed a couple years ago because her bladder cancer was so severe that the things that she enjoyed doing she could no longer do, and she was in pain. And the deprivationist could explain why that was not only good for her, but in her interest. And the Epicurean who wants to say, well, you should do the thing that'll make your total well-being higher than it would be otherwise, they can explain that. But if you go the route where you say that just doesn't matter prudentially, because you can't compare non-existence to continued life that makes your well-being higher or lower, then they're at a sort of impasse in the decision there. And I find that hard to believe that it couldn't be, you can't make sense of the idea that it would be good to mercy kill, in this case a pet, because it's going to prevent them from having days that would be on the whole bad for them.
I mean, their view of good becomes very divorced from what we have reason to do, which is odd in itself.
Yeah. Right. I think the primary deprivationism has a lot of issues that need to be worked out. There's paradoxes that arise with respect to it. But at its core, I think one of the fundamental things that counts in favor of the view is that it preserves this link between whether an event is overall good or bad for you and the prudential reason that you have to seek or avoid that event. Whereas Epicureanism has to divorce those two things. It has to sever the connection between whether something is overall good or bad for you and whether it's in your prudential interest to seek or avoid it. And that just is pretty divorced from how we seem to use the term.
It's a logical segue to another idea that from a paper I read by you, and that is as you said, the deprivation account seems to get it right a lot. It gets it right, and we think ultimately it's the best account we have of the badness of death. And so again, it says that the badness of death is a function of the goodness of the life you would have had you not died. You could say something like that. So if you have only pain ahead of you, then death can be better than that. But if you would have led a good life if you hadn't died, then death is very bad for you, right? So now, but you also say that this view still has some counterintuitive implications and so on. I found that very interesting that you wrote about that. Like, what would be one such counterintuitive implication?
Yeah. So there's a number. I think the one that's discussed among the most is what is sometimes called the overdetermination problem. Now that the technical description is something like the cause of you dying prematurely is overdetermined. But the non-technical, sort of intuitive way to understand it, I think, appeals to another example. This one goes to Jeff McMahon. It's called The Young Pedestrian. He said, imagine that a person walks into the road and unfortunately gets hit by a bus and killed. And when they're performing an autopsy on the body, the doctor discovers that this person had an aneurysm, or they had an aneurysm that was going to burst. And they could tell it was going to burst if they hadn't died pretty soon after. The deprivation view is going to entail that dying by being hit by the bus was not very bad for this young person because it only deprived them of, let's say it would have been a week before they would have died of an aneurysm. That's a bit of a fanciful case, but take a case of somebody who's in combat and they die on the battlefield. And in many actual cases, very plausibly, if they hadn't died on the battlefield by one person, they would have died a short time later by a different person. And the deprivation view is going to entail that death by whichever soldier killed them was not very bad for them because it only deprived them of a short amount of time of life, whatever life that they would have had before they were killed a short time later. And that can seem counterintuitive because it could imply that a young being's, a 19-year-old soldier's death was less bad for them than a 96-year-old man's death who would have died, let's say, 2 weeks after their actual death, had they not died at the time that they did.
I mean, these are amazing examples to test the view. So someone dies from one cause, medical cause, and then they have an autopsy, and then you say, oh, yeah, but he had also this cancer that would have killed him in a few days. So then we have to conclude, so it wasn't so bad for him to die from the first cause, when in fact we say, well, here's a young man who died. That's really, really bad. But the deprivation view, which seems like such a solid view, then has a problem here, it seems like.
Yes,
yeah,
it does, but it's a problem that I think can be solved. So there's three quick things I'd want to say in response to this, so there's much more that can be said. So one thing is that the deprivation view is just a view about how bad the event of death is for the being that dies. It is not going to entail anything, strictly speaking, about how bad it is from the perspective of the world, or like how tragic the death is, or anything along those lines. So you might think, a turtle, if somebody kills a tortoise, that's 20, and a human person, that's 20. The tortoise might be deprived of more net good life, since they have much longer lifespans, but nevertheless, you might think that the human death was more tragic or worse for the world, or bad in some other way besides prudentially bad for the tortoise and the human being. Or we can say that's in some sense worse than the tortoise death. You could hold that view if you wanted to. Deprivationism doesn't rule it out. The other thing to say is that this doesn't capture the way we talk, but if we're precise enough in our individuation of which events we're talking about, I think deprivationism can capture the view that something really bad has happened to the young pedestrian and to the soldier. So take the soldier case and imagine that had they not died on the battlefield at one time, they would have died 20 minutes later by somebody else. that seems terrible and tragic. We could say that the event of being killed by the first soldier, that event was not very bad for them, because had that not happened, they would have died 20 minutes later. But we can say going to war, that was really bad for them, because had that event not happened, they would have lived a much longer, happier life, by hypothesis. So any time where we talk about some overdetermined event, I think there's we can go further back along the causal line and identify some singular event, or maybe a cluster of different events that, had those things together not happened, would have resulted in the person living a much longer, better life. And then we can say that's the locus of the really bad thing. So in the young pedestrian case, having an aneurysm and being hit by a bus, that was really bad for him, because by hypothesis, had he not had an aneurysm and had he not been hit by a bus, he would have lived a much longer, happier life. The third and final quick thing that I'll say for that is, it can though counterintuitive initially, I think it can make sense of what third parties would be obligated to do. So suppose that you're on the battlefield, and you, being the wise philosopher that you are, you can foresee what's going to happen to each person, and you know this soldier's death is going to be overdetermined. If I save him now, he'll die 20 minutes later. And this other soldier, their death is not overdetermined. If I save him now, they'll live a long, happy life. And suppose you just unfortunately lack the ability to save both of them, and you lack the ability to prevent the overdetermined death. You could prevent one, but you couldn't prevent the killing a short time later. What should you do? Well, I think very clearly you should save the soldier whose death is not overdetermined, precisely because that would be much better for them, because they'll live a much longer, happier life. If you save the soldier whose death is overdetermined, then, again, it's just part of the details of the case. You know that they're going to die 20 minutes later, and that's not going to be very good for them. It's not going to be very good for them to prevent them from that death, because they just get a short bit of time of life. So I think we have to sort of accept that prudentially overdetermined deaths are not very bad for the beings that die, even though we could explain what I think is the relevant intuition if we're a little more fine-grained in how we talk about the cases.
I mean, the deprivation view will always be, let's say, imprecise, in that it must deal in possible worlds, so what we imagine to be what would have been, and what's most likely would have been. But exactly, I mean, philosophers talk about the possible worlds that are very close and possible worlds that are very far and so on, but there doesn't seem to be any way of making a principled decision exactly where you stop imagining what could have been. So the reason I'm saying that is that you could say that today, if you live in a country, for example, that has very bad health care, in some sense, from the deprivation account, in many of cases where people die, well, they would have died pretty soon anyway. But that's because of the way their healthcare happens to be. So in their closest possible world, they would have died early anyway, right? And so it becomes less bad in some sense. But as you said, well, but then the situation is bad or something like that. But still, even if you think about like today in Sweden or some advanced country, you could say, well, compared to if we had put the efforts to curing aging, and we have been further along on that, every death now is quite bad.
I think that's exactly right. So I want to be fairly liberal in allowing those comparisons, maybe unlike some other deprivationists. People like Jeff McMahon, who has a deprivationist view that builds in some additional components, like the overlap in psychological continuity over time. Anyway, some will want to sort of restrict those claims in some realistic way. I want to say it's like what's scientifically feasible, or what the laws of physics allow, what's nomologically possible. I don't want to do that. I want to say both of those comparative statements that you made are true. And then any event that we think of is really under-described when we talk about it in everyday discourse, and we can make a lot more fine-grained comparisons. And those events in the sort of general description will be good relative to some alternatives and bad relative to other alternatives. And I think each of those is going to generate fitting attitudes. And it's a little surprising because that's not how we tend to talk about these events, but that's just because we have a sort of limited capacity and most people don't think about these in that much detail, and there's certain counterfactual comparisons that are really salient to us, and they're picked up by conversational context, so we tend to focus on those. But that doesn't mean the ones that we are less likely to pay attention to aren't apt as well. So I want to be very liberal in that way.
If somebody is 95 or so and they die, then people say, well, they had a long life, and they're not quite very much bothered by it. But that's because they're comparing to what is possible in today's context, what is normal. So as long as you are dying within a normal death span, so to speak, your death is not bad for most people, or not terrible, or something like that. It's not a tragedy or something like that. They're not that bothered by it. But of course, someone like me, I see it as very bad for this 95-year-old person to die. But I am comparing to, well, a world where he continued to have his youthfulness and etc., which is also a possible world.
So there's a few things I think I'd want to say about that. On my own view, I want to say, if the 95-year-old dies, very likely the event of their death, say it's a heart attack, is not very bad for them, because had that event not happened, they probably would have lived a short time longer and died. But it's also true, you pointed out, that the nearest possible world in which we'd had more advanced anti-aging technology, it's very bad for them to live in the actual world relative to that possible world where they live much longer. And I think that can generate a fitting, extremely negative attitude. Now, you're right that people's intuitions are often guided by what seems plausible at the time, but I think that presents a series of issues that haven't been able to been satisfactorily worked out yet. So, one issue is what's the relevant class of beings that you're looking at to make these judgments? What's setting the norm? So take somebody who has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It's a muscular disease that affects men, and they tend to die in their 20s, if I'm not mistaken. So somebody who is born with that, discovered that they had it at a young age. What's the norm for the group of men that have Duchenne muscular dystrophy? Dying really early, and then somebody might live into their late 30s, which is where I'm at right now, and die. And they died very young relative to humans, relative to human men, relative to humans in the 21st century, relative to humans in affluent nations, but they died really old relative to the class of men that have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And I want to know, what's the relevant group here? Is it all humans? Is it human men? Is it people in their socioeconomic status at this time? Is it within a 5-year span, a 100-year span? I don't think there's a good answer to that question. We can just talk about how well or poorly they did relative to different groups. And I think that problem generalizes. So that's one reason I wouldn't want to do that. The other is I want to maintain a symmetry between intrinsic and extrinsic badness. So that's abstract, but take a case where, imagine a world, and this goes back to something that Nagel said, where everybody, just as a result of their genes, has to live in chronic pain. I'm amending Nagel's case. Has to live in chronic pain their entire life. And it's not metaphysically possible for that being to exist and not be in chronic pain, I suppose. It's a genetic condition that's causing it. I think that's bad for them, and they should feel, it's totally fitting for them to feel bad about that. And it should provide no comfort to say, well, look, the world in which you're not in chronic pain is not only really far away, it's just not even metaphysically possible. We'd have to move to mere logical possibility. So like, hey, good news, right? Like, no, the pain is just as bad for them.
It's still bad.
Yeah, still bad. Yeah, and I don't see any in principle reason to treat extrinsic badness differently from intrinsic badness. So if we can look at really far away possible worlds to generate fitting attitudes about overall badness when we're talking about intrinsic badness, I'd want to do the same for extrinsic badness. The world could be very far away where we live an infinitely good life. Doesn't matter. It's still much worse for us to be here than the infinitely good life, and it's fitting to feel bad about it.
This episode of Levity is brought to you by Vitalism Foundation.
Vitalism Foundation is a non-profit with a revolutionary mission to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health.
It's a community of action driven by vitalism, a new moral philosophy whose first tenet is that life and health are good, death is humanity's core problem, and aging its primary agent. They're one of the few groups that truly understand aging as the emergency that it is.
Vitalism's goal is nothing short of monumental: to allocate 1% of global GDP to this project. It's ambitious, but it's exactly what's needed to tackle aging head-on.
As a member of Vitalism, you'll get access to a private community, exclusive content, and invites to special conferences. Plus, you'll receive insider prices on longevity wellness services from Vitalism's mission-aligned partners.
But more than that, you will be supporting a mission that's too important to leave to others to tackle.
So, you should really join us. Follow the link in the description below. For a limited time, you get 30% off forever. Just use the promo code LEVITY at checkout.
Again, that's 30% off forever with the promo code LEVITY. Let's make a difference together. It's interesting you mentioned Thomas Nagel. So Thomas Nagel, he wrote, I think, 1971 or so. He wrote an article called "Death" that I think is fantastic. And so on the one hand, he I think at the end he's touching on what we're talking about now. He says normalcy has nothing to do with this. That he finds himself as a kind of subject, and the context is not part of him in some sense. That he can project himself hundreds of years forward. There's no principal limit for him to imagine that he has his health and continues living. There's really nothing very difficult in imagining that. And then, of course, he says, "But is that do we have to take in the kind of contingent limitations into what we can imagine to be good here?" It's an interesting discussion. I mean, it's hard to see that there would be something rationally compelling that we have to limit our frame of reference to the most kind of narrow possible world.
Yeah, I agree, but you might worry that it opens Pandora's box, so to speak. So Kyla Draper has a nice example where she says, we live in a world where we don't have Aladdin's lamp. But if you were to talk to me today and find out that I was lamenting not having Aladdin's lamp, that would at least seem very odd, especially if there are other things that maybe aren't as comparably bad, but far more realistic. So if you see me in a hospital and I have a broken leg, and suppose I'm being turned away because I don't have insurance and I can't pay the bill. They wouldn't actually do that, but suppose in this world I'm being turned away for that, and I'm like crying, and you're like, "Oh, this is terrible. You must be bummed out about your leg." And I said, "Well, yeah, technically yes, but really the thing that's bugging me is I don't have Aladdin's lamp, because getting my leg fixed would help me some, and maybe like the world in which they fix my leg is very close, but Aladdin's lamp, that would help me so much more. That's the thing that's at the forefront of my mind now. That's what's bugging me. You might think I'm not a sane person if that was my response to you. So you might worry that being too liberal in the way that allowing comparisons would make that sort of thing seem permissible.
I can see that, but it still feels it's somewhat underdetermined, and I I think it's going to be very hard to pin that down in a principle that this much possible world you can imagine, and no further you can't. Why not? As long as it's. I mean, for example, I lament that aging science hasn't been invested in as much as it could have been, and so that now my parents would be in better health and I would also enjoy more, etc., etc. I mean, this is not Aladdin's lamp at all. It's far closer to the actual world.
Right. That's right. But maybe kind of would say, well, that suggests like that's what you should care about, because it's much closer to the actual world than one that's far away. But I also agree with you that there's not an in principle way to draw the line between which worlds are relevantly close. And so I think this is a case where no matter where you go, you're going to have to say something that's pretty counterintuitive. To try to sugar the pill about Aladdin's lamp, I mean, my own view is, well, the things that should sort of occupy your deliberation in many cases are going to have to take into account the practical benefits of doing so. There's nothing that I can do to get myself Aladdin's lamp, but if I'm spending my time thinking about what could I do to fix my broken leg, who could I go to help me?
Yeah.
If that's at the forefront of my mind, I'm more likely to be able to make decisions that are going to make me better off than I otherwise would be. So what I'm deliberating about, I think, could be constrained by these practical realities. But if we're just talking about how comparatively good or bad various things are for me, I don't see any reason to even in principle limit the relevant sorts of comparisons.
I really like the way you think of good and bad, and you compare it to also reasoning about what we have reason to do, because I think they must be quite tightly connected for good and bad to be interesting. And it's also, if you look at why we have terms like good and bad, I mean, they must have evolved because they're pointing us towards a certain way of behaving towards facts. And so, for example, if somebody said, well, death for you is neither good nor bad, well, then they're saying, well, I don't have a reason to avoid it and I don't have a reason to pursue it. Which is, as you point out, blatantly false. I can have reason to pursue it, and I can have a reason to avoid it, and so their view falls. I mean, right?
Yeah, I think so. If they're using the terms in the same way that I'm using the terms, and they said that death is neither good nor bad, then that seems to suggest that they're biting the bullet on what's prudent to do.
Yeah.
And that I'm not sure that that's even a coherent thing. I'm not even sure there's a coherent way to work out those sets of judgments.
Yeah, I mean, if good is not to be pursued and bad is not to be avoided, I mean, why would we have these terms in the first place? You could make it kind of. I like that argument. I was thinking about.
And what do they even mean? Like they're often
exactly.
defined in terms of one another, and if we're not able to define them in terms of one another in this way, it's sort of unclear how that concept is even being spelled out coherently. So I'm not sure what they even mean at that.
Yeah, if you look at language as a tool and the words have to do something, I mean, then good has to direct us towards something, and bad has to direct us away from something. Right? It's quite interesting. So the way you are doing philosophy, I would say, it's analytical. You could say you're slowing things down. You're looking at meaning. You're saying, look, here we might have, to a large degree, a merely verbal dispute, or and that can be dissolved just by pointing out that, look, what do you really disagree with if you are granting that it can be a good idea to continue a longer life, etc. Then you can't say that also death is neither good nor bad, right? So how would you characterize your style of philosophy?
Yes, you did it better than I could. It's very much in the vein of contemporary analytic philosophy. that involves some logic chopping and going deep into very increasingly narrow questions to try to make progress, and considering trying to make a sound argument in favor of one position, and then considering what sorts of reasons you could give to reject various premises and see whether those stand up to scrutiny. And sometimes that, I think, allows us to make progress where I would even be so bold as to claim that I know deprivationism is true and that I know certain other substantive philosophical theses are true. But just as often, if not, more often actually, it'll highlight the limitations of philosophical knowledge and progress, and will hit literal paradoxes where there's sets of propositions, all of which seem very plausibly true but are shown to be inconsistent, and then the arguments for and against rejecting various ones each have things going for them and against them, and then I don't know where to go there, so I can adjust my credences accordingly, and then the appropriate thing to do is to be agnostic about that. And I think that's a valuable form of progress too, is realizing that I don't know this, and maybe in many cases even in principle can't know it, because there's no way to adjudicate between the fundamental claims that we would take to resolve certain paradoxes. But so that's the style that I value a lot, and it's also the way that my mind works. That's the one where I feel more comfortable doing that, rather than a more historically oriented approach, and rather than the continental approach to philosophy.
I would say your style is in the tradition of early 20th century philosophy too. I mean, Russell and Wittgenstein, and but also language philosophy, where and I think that's was really an advance, although it will take time to bear all its fruits. This analytic, and also then the more linguistic style. I mean, so they're allergic to big concepts that can't be that can't be given concrete examples, for example. And I love the way that you're testing the theory constantly by concrete examples. So if we believe in this view, then it should be able to match this. And then sometimes you have to kind of reject your intuitions about the case because the theory is right. The principle is correct, and sometimes you have to modify your principle. So it's a kind of science that's going on, and it's both inside your mind, and but it also borrows from outside, so to speak. Say a bit more about what's going on.
Well, I don't know if I could. Yeah. You put it so perfectly. Anything that I say is going to sound crass and dumb by comparison. But yeah, that's exactly right. There's more to say about metaphilosophy with respect to what you should do when your first order judgments conflict with the principles that you appeal to. Sometimes it's very clear that you should reject the first order judgments because the principles you might think of as analytic truths, it would be impossible for them to be false. Other times, thinking through the relevant principles might reveal why the first order judgment was mistaken, and it can change what actually seems counterintuitive. So what might have initially seemed like a bullet to bite, an unpalatable consequence of the view, in retrospect might not actually seem so bad. But other times there's not an explanation like that, and you're just stuck with having to give up something, either a principle that seems very prima facie intuitive, or a first order judgment that seems very prima facie intuitive. And there I'm convinced by work that other philosophers have done, including Peter Singer, that our judgments about the principles are on a whole more reliable than our judgments about first order cases. There's too many sort of spurious factors that can affect our judgment about first order cases, like status quo bias, that is less likely to affect our judgments about first principles. Those aren't going to be perfect, of course. They're going to be thinking through each of these are just going to be highly fallible. But if all else is equal, I err on the side of deferring to the principles and biting the bullets in the first order cases rather than the alternative. I don't know if that helped or see now. I just muddied the waters, and
No,
what you said sounded far better.
I doubt that.
Can I ask you guys? I mean, we've had several discussions on this topic with Patrick and others, and now you, Travis. We seem to go back to Epicurus and Lucretius and those guys. And were there any? Because I mean, during history, there's been. It hasn't been short of people wanting to reach immortality or seeking the fountain of youth, and I mean, alchemy was the big thing with alchemy was finding the philosopher's stone and so on. Were there any philosophers worthy of their name that actually was pro-longevity back in the day, or is this a recent phenomenon where you actually have do the argument that death is something bad, or that it deprives you of something good?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to say not anything in the vein of Bernard Williams. All right, not anything like that, where he is what John Fisher calls an immortality curmudgeon, where he thinks anything that would result in an immortal life for us would either be something that we wouldn't want to live because our future self should change so much to enjoy the life that we'd be alienated from that, or we would become internally bored because we didn't change. Now, there's lots of works of fiction that defend a sort of immortality curmudgeon view. So Williams talks about the Macropolis case, which is a Czech opera. There's the story of the man who did not wish to die, I think by Ozaki. I might be misremembering the last name, but that's I believe a Japanese work of fiction that's supposed to highlight why immortality would be bad for creatures like us. There's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was one of the earliest surviving fictional works that raises that. But there's not like philosophical responses to that. Though I do take that to have been sort of the default position. Just like it is now, most people are inclined to think death is bad, immortality would be good for us. And many people, at least after the rise of various monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, think that in fact they will be immortal and that their life will be infinitely good for them when they continue to exist in some sort of afterlife as an immaterial being. So maybe the explanation for the lack of philosophical arguments for this position is just because it was one that was so widely accepted. That was taken to be the default, and if you were going against the grain, you might feel a compulsion to argue.
This was quite the opposite of what I thought. I thought that philosophy was kind of the idea with philosophy is to explain away death, so we don't have to worry about it. And so, are you saying that what we got instead was religion? So we had religion, and therefore there was no point in philosophers trying to speak for immortality, so to speak.
I see. No, maybe I misspoke. That was most people, including philosophers, believed that immortality could be good for you, and that could be a plausible explanation for why there's not historical works defending the idea that immortality could be good for you. And then it also is the case that there could be some that I'm just not aware of because of my ignorance about the history of philosophy.
Researching my book, I didn't find any ancient philosophy that defended prolongevity or extending earthly life, that would be a good thing. I only found apologists. I only found philosophers saying that, oh, you common man, you're a fool, and here's why you shouldn't want to stay on this earth, right? So The Platonists say, well, this is not even real. The real thing is awaiting the philosopher in the next life. And the Epicureans say that death is not, cannot be bad for you. And the Stoics say that everything that's natural is good, and death is natural and it cannot be bad for you. And the cynics don't care about anything much. So, I mean, I didn't find anyone who say, well, look, all these guys are, like my book, for example, all these guys are wrong, and really it's terrible that we die, and it would be much better if we could extend life on Earth. And I didn't find that. I mean, you find that, as you said, in perhaps Gilgamesh, you find that yearning. And as in Peter, when you researched your book, you found a lot of examples of people trying and wanting more life, but not philosophers. It really is, I think, the philosophical attitude is people come to the philosopher, and the philosophers tell them something to make them accept death and the conditions of life. I mean, as I say, it's almost funny to imagine going to a wise man on the mountain with long beard and you know, tell us about death. Oh, very bad. It's very, very bad for you. You know, it's completely contrary to the view we have of what the philosopher's job is. And especially ancient philosophers, because their view is the most important thing is, of course, philosophy as therapy of the soul and making you a happy, functional person. And to fear death, that's in the way of that goal.
I think people have that impression. Like, didn't Cicero say to philosophize is to learn how to die?
Typical.
And some of my friends and family who don't, really know what contemporary philosophers do, when I had said that I worked on this, they would sort of ask me for like what are sort of like comforting aphorisms I'd have about death. Mm-hmm. And to their surprise, the answer is no, it's bad. It's bad for you, and you should feel bad about it. It's sort of depressing, but I'm after the truth, not after things that'll make you feel good.
Yeah.
But the other
I
thing
already
is,
knew that.
Yeah, they already knew
what
that.
the hell do I need a philosopher for?
Absolutely. It's a derelict of
I've got a deductive proof for you. If there was any doubt,
Yeah.
now I can erase that, and you can. Yeah, but I also think there's just some sort of proclivity to argue against the grain and to not defend default positions. So I would not be surprised if many philosophers thought death is bad for you, mortality is good. But why argue for that? In the same way that before, before it became controversial whether it's permissible to eat meat in the Western world in the 1970s, before like Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, there weren't philosophers defending the permissibility of eating meat in philosophy journals, because that was sort of taken as a given. And if you were going against the grain, that would merit writing the article. If you wrote something defending something everyone believed at the time, you're less likely to to get an audience that way. And that's why you don't see philosophers now tend to write about why it's permissible for people to have a homosexual sex. That was controversial enough in like the 80s and 90s for philosophers to defend that sort of position. That would be put in introduction to ethics text, and now you don't see that in any introduction to ethics text that came out in the last decade from reputable presses, because that's just not something that there's substantial disagreement about now. So it's not going against the grain to defend that view.
But also this idea of philosophy as therapy, if you look at the ancient world, the philosopher is a kind of psychologist as well. Someone there to help you live the good life and so on. And that's not the analytical school. I mean, you don't go to Frege and Russell to lead the good life, or Wittgenstein, for sure.
Right. Even more derivative than psychologists, some of them are really just like self-help hacks. It's not a popular view to say something so derogatory about these ancient, but yeah.
But there is something to that. I mean, there is the truth and the tranquility of the soul. These are two different goals, and they can come apart. I mean, when we're lucky, they come together, but in this topic, they might just come apart. So it might be very comforting to think that death can't harm us, but it might also be false. We say it's false, but of course, we don't set ourselves up to be therapeutic in our philosophy. I mean, we are old-fashioned, just we want the truth as we see it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
So, I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah, I was thinking about revisiting something you talked about earlier. You mentioned the soldier on the battlefield and which person you should save, a person that would go on to live for, I don't know, a full life, or a person that would go on to live for like 20 minutes. And what if that person who has 20 minutes left has this really, really transcendental experience, and it's like finds the meaning of life, and just finds so wonderful everything, and the other person that goes on to live for 100 years more or so, it's okay. He's, he's getting by. It's fine, but uh, he's kind of bitter at the end, and so on. How do you? I guess what I'm getting at is this: we often finds ourselves thinking about this time aspect, that more time is intrinsically good. How should I think about that?
Yeah, good question. I'm glad you asked that because I was maybe too simplistic in the description and presupposing as a background that each moment of their subsequent life would be equally good. But of course, that's not true. How should you think about whether time is intrinsically good? I think it's just not, that it doesn't matter in and of itself. What matters in and of itself are the intrinsic goods that you accrue in that time. And someone could live 100 years and their net amount of intrinsic good that they could accrue could be zero. It could be negative. It could be some positive amount, but it could also be less in total net quantity than something that someone could accrue in 20 minutes. So my view is then you should save the person whose death is worse for them. Also assuming that they both deserve to be saved and they have the same family, same number of loved ones and so on, right? If we're holding everything else fixed, we should just do what's going to be better for the person that you're saving. And if that means that they have more good life in 20 minutes than someone else has in 100 years, then go for the 20 minutes. The time itself doesn't matter. It just sort of correlates with having the ability to accrue more overall good, but it's not a guarantee of that by any stretch of the imagination.
And I think also that sometimes people think about us advocating for indefinite lifespans or solving aging and so on. They think that it's so important to us that we live for an indefinite amount of time. But for me, it's more like life is good now. I want to continue living it tomorrow, right? What happens in 10, 20, 100, 200 years, I don't think about that. It's more that aging is not something I can choose to not suffer from, right? And death is kind of the extremist version of aging.
Yeah, but you had someone on the last episode that I think aired at this time of this recording was the scientist that you had on who was talking about all the anti-aging progress that they've made in mice. So you might have to start thinking about what your life would look like 200-300 years from now, depending on how rapidly that progresses, which from your episode, AI, in conjunction with scientists working towards this, could conceivably generate some very, very rapid progression on that front.
Sure, and that's what we hope for. I think, although I just think that sometimes in the conversation people get hung up on the fact that we're talking about living for a very, very long time. Of course, that's what we want, but that also it doesn't mean that it's life at any price,
Yeah.
So.
Right. Yeah. There's some ways of radically extending life that would probably not be good for us.
Yeah.
And
If someone said to me, you could live for 500 years, but you have to sit in a small cell with no windows, and we'll put some soup under the door for you every day, and you can never talk to anyone. Of course, I wouldn't want that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people lose their sanity in solitary confinement within a matter of weeks often.
Yeah.
Hundreds of years, like much longer than any human has ever lived, that sounds mind-bogglingly awful. I wouldn't want that.
There was a survey by Stanford University in 2015 when they asked people about their views of radical life extension. And if they said, they want to live 120 plus, but you don't have your physical strength and you don't have your mental ability, then only less than 1 in 3 would be interested in living that long without their physical and mental abilities intact.
Yeah.
But if you postulated both mental and physical abilities intact, then 80% 8 of 10 wanted radical life extension. So it's very sensitive to that. Now, but I always want to add here that I think people are mistaken about how healthy they have to be to find life worth living. When I ask my students, they usually say they hope to be dead before 80 or 85 because, and then they say things like, because I might be in a wheelchair. And then I say, there are people living their whole life in a wheelchair and they can have a good life, So,
Yeah.
and I look at my father who's had a couple of strokes and so on, he's in a very, very bad shape, but he's still enjoying life.
Yeah, right. So I think they underestimate how resilient they would be, and there's lots of empirical studies where people who have various disabilities and self-report happiness on a scale, and then of course there's limitations to those, but by and large, people do a lot better in those situations than those who are not in that situation would think. Just might be the naivety of youth.
The fact that we're dealing with ancient arguments, so Epicurus like 300 BC, and now you are adding to the discussion, in some sense it's really fantastic, and especially when you've actually, I think, done something really, worthwhile and new and a good perspective like you have. I mean, it's quite a big thing to be part of a discussion that stretches over millennia like that, and then still be able to say, look at this, here's something you might have missed, or right. I mean, if it's true that any plausible or viable version of the Epicurean argument has to accept that we can have a reason to not want to die, is actually collapsing or actually giving up and conceding to the deprivation account, that's really something.
It's rewarding in a way that making an intervention into a contemporary debate that wasn't an issue for a variety of reasons in the last decade is, I feel more drawn to those debates partly for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's really huge in some sense. I mean, you forget that sometimes when you sit there and struggle through these ideas. But it's
Can I ask you
fantastic,
both? Can I ask you both? Let's say that there were absolutely no progress on tackling aging. That the evidence was pointing more and more towards it not being malleable. We can't do anything about it. Would that in any way change the way you think about this, the way you hold your positions now? Or would you say the exact same thing? Is it totally independent of what is actually happening in the world at large?
So for me, it would change various things, but some of the questions that I think these philosophers are addressing concern necessary truths. Like, could it be bad for you to have an event that causes you to have a lower total well-being if it results in your non-existence, right? And I think the answer to that question is going to necessarily be yes or no. So whenever you're dealing with necessary truths like logic or mathematics, then I think, as a matter of fact, those truths aren't going to be affected by any contingent facts that happen in the empirical world. And presumably, whether we could make anti-aging work is going to be a contingent fact. It's going to be something that we discover about the way that our world is that could have been different. But it would, but those necessary truths that we discover in conjunction with empirical facts can generate different views than you might have anticipated. So if you think, even though this isn't the position that I defend, but if you think like Jeff McMahon, that the possibilities that we could lament missing out on are constrained by some realism condition. And we realize that immortality is outside the realm of being realistic, then that means we shouldn't lament it. Now, that's going to be these necessary truths about what generates sort of fitting attitudes with these contingent facts about the way the world is, and that's going to generate a conclusion about that. Yeah, and it would change views about like what should we put our time and resources into, and if this is not feasible for life extension. And we have views about what sorts of events are overall good and bad for people, and a moral theory about how to weigh the interest of all the choices available, of all the beings affected by the choices available to us. That can generate strong moral reason to start putting our money in other things that could be beneficial for people. Maybe not life extension, but for instance, making it the case that people don't have to sleep, and then that way they could have more waking hours and they could have more good life. Or maybe curing diseases, even if it's going to be limited, which sorts of ones would make the most impact, even if it's all comparably incremental. So I think it would change a lot of these like sort of first order philosophical issues that arise, but it wouldn't affect the necessary truths that those have to go into our judgments to determine what we should do with respect to the first order cases, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Plus, geoscience and solving aging, I mean, there's no question that it is physically possible to do. It's just depending on what happens. So it's not Aladdin's lamp. It's entirely within the natural and possible world. So that was one of the arguments. Then there's another argument that I would love to talk to you about, where I think we might have different views on some aspect of it, and that is the mirror argument, or the argument that it wasn't so bad for us not to exist before we were born, so it's not going to be so bad for us to cease to exist, because it's the same non-existence. It wasn't so bad before you were born or conceived. You know all about it. It was nothing. And it's going to be nothing again. And so it's going to be that same old nothing that wasn't so bad. So here we go again, right? So it can't really be bad. So I found the paragraph in Lucretius, if I may read, where he makes this argument.
Please.
So this is he was active just before the birth of Christ. Look back at eternity before we were born, when we felt nothing. This is a mirror of death. Nature holds before us a sight of time that was, a time past and gone, no different from what is to come. If this past troubles us not, if we lie in peace with it, why do we fear the time that would follow our death?
Right.
And so perhaps we don't have to think of death as so bad. It's just like not being born. What do you think about that?
Right. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I hope that they're coherent. So I think one thing that comes out is in the original passage, that seems to be more of an attitude about how you should feel about death, rather than whether the event of death is something that could be prudentially bad for you. And contemporary philosophers have sort of given both iterations of that argument. So there's one version of the argument that says it's not bad for you to not have come into the world earlier, even if you would have had a longer, happier life. And that's symmetrical to dying, so it's likewise not bad for you to not die later. And then there's the fear version. So you could say you shouldn't have feared not having come into the world earlier. You shouldn't have feared the period of prenatal non-existence. And that's relevantly similar to your posthumous non-existence, so you shouldn't fear posthumous non-existence. And those things could interestingly come apart. You might think something, and this is actually what I think, something could be bad for you without it meriting fear. I take the object of fear to necessitate something that is sufficiently intrinsically bad. And on my deprivationist view, death is not intrinsically bad. It's not bad in and of itself. It's only extrinsically bad, and extrinsically bad insofar as it prevents us from getting additional intrinsic good. So if you run the symmetry argument with respect to the attitude of fear, then I just say, like, yeah, that's right. You shouldn't have feared the period of non-existence before you came into this world, because that's nothing to fear. And you likewise, that is relevantly similar to the non-existence after death, so you shouldn't fear that. And with respect to the badness question, I want to say something different. I'm going to say, if you could have been born earlier and had a longer, better life as a result, then that is bad for you. The event of your birth is bad for you if it's true that had you not been born at the time you were, you would have been born earlier and had more good life. And that is symmetrical to the event of death, where if you didn't die when you did, you would have died later and lived a longer, happier life. Now, I just use different terminology. I should say I'm using birth as a shorthand for the moment you came into existence, even though you obviously exist before you're born. But it's just, I just use that term to refer to the moment that you come into existence, just for the sake of simplicity.
I was thinking that what you said earlier about when I asked you if progress in the world as a whole should change your positions in any way, and you said that mostly no, right? And I was thinking that the only thing that would be different for me is that I would be more miserable, because there is nothing we can do about aging, and it's bad to die because you're missing out on something good, right? So I would just be more miserable. But when I think about being born earlier, I'm not more miserable, because how could I be? I mean, it's completely impossible for me to have been born earlier. No?
Well, no. So first, I don't.
Oh,
I don't
Peter.
think
This is the crux. This is where I have to say I'm a little bit inside the box, because Travis, you have a view here. It's a bit different.
Yes, that's one way to describe it. I have a view. Well, let me just preface this with I think the scientific discoveries about the feasibility of achieving immortality is not going to change the necessary truths, but it could change lots and lots of applied questions. So I didn't mean to imply that there was very few of those. There could be even more numerous. It's just they would all be located with respect to the applied issues. Okay, so my view, could you not be born earlier? Well, in some cases, in actual cases, I think there are people who could have come into existence earlier if they were created through in vitro fertilization, where the fertilized egg was frozen for a while before being implanted, and could have been implanted earlier rather than later. I think there are real world cases like that, and those actual people are ones that could have been born earlier. Now, it's also true that in those cases, had they been born earlier, they probably would have died earlier as well. And if it doesn't affect how much total well-being they have in their life, then it's not bad for them. But maybe in some cases, and I couldn't know because we couldn't know the counterfactual here, if somebody was born earlier, their life might have unfolded in different ways where they would have had more overall good. And I think those would be real world cases where somebody's birth was in fact bad for them. And if they knew that, then it would be perfectly fitting for them to feel bad about that, in the same way that it would be fitting for them to feel bad about being deprived of an earlier life. But people who were conceived normally, in one sense, it's probably not possible for them to have been born substantially earlier, because I take the zygote that they came from to have only been able to have been created through the particular sperm and egg combination. And in order for that to happen, the world had to unfold in the way that it did, because even slight changes would have resulted in different zygotes coming into existence, because you have different sperm and egg combinations, or the failure to create a zygote in the first place. So in the actual world, I think there's almost nobody that you can truthfully say had their actual birth not occurred, they would have been born earlier and lived a longer, better life. But it is possible in other senses. I think it's what's called nomologically possible, metaphysically possible, and logically possible for everybody to have been born substantially earlier in time and had a longer, better life as a result. Now, in order to do that, you have to move to worlds that are very far away from the actual world, so to speak. You have to imagine things unfolding very differently. So maybe the Big Bang happens, and then there's a shorter period of time between the event of the Big Bang and the creation of Earth, and then you hold everything else fixed, except people's death date. That's definitely, I think, metaphysically possible because I can conceive of it without contradiction. But the world would have to be very, very, very different from the way that it actually is for it to have unfolded like that. That's just radically different on so many levels. But nevertheless, it's metaphysically possible, and I think that matters in the same way that it matters if you're in chronic pain as a result of a genetic condition, and it's merely logically possible for you to not be in pain. That doesn't prevent you being comparably worse off in the world that you are in with chronic pain, rather than a merely logically far away possible world where you're pain-free. And just like you can lament not being in that world, I think we could lament not having more good life as a result of not having been born earlier, which is a really sort of radical thing to say. But the last thing I'll say, and then I want to hear what you think about this, is to try to blunt the force of that. I think what really matters is what we care about is just having more overall good life. And we're really indifferent to whether that comes from holding our birth date fixed and extending our death date, or going to a farther away possible world where we're born much earlier, live a life like we have now, but we just have more good life as a result. We just want more good life, and it's sort of natural to think about it or focus on extending it via the end of our life rather than the beginning. But in principle, I wouldn't want to rule that out. I want to say both of those are bad.
Do you take into account our history here, or is it just in principle? I mean, if you take into account our history, having been born earlier, of course, if I was born in the 1950s or 1960s, okay, maybe. But if I was born in the 14th century, I'm not sure that would have been a good thing, because I would have been a lot poorer. There would have been a lot more infectious disease, and my quality of life might have been really, really bad compared to how rich I am compared to people 800 years ago.
Yes. I mean, that's right. So if we're imagining that you're born earlier, but everything else is held fixed, then very often I think being born earlier would be quite bad for the person that died. Not just because of, less, the life of a member of a royal family in the 18th century is like not as good as my life now as just some middle class philosopher, because of the advancements in technology and all of that. That's certainly true, and I think that's exactly right. The other thing to say about this question is what people like, Nagel says it in Death, and then Frederick Kaufman has really developed this thought. If we're imagining cases where only you is moved up earlier in time, even if your life is just as good or better overall, you might not want that because of how it would change you. So your identity would be the same, presumably, but the way that you live your life would be so radically different that we might not want that. So if I were born in 1976 rather than 1986, just a mere 10 years difference, I would have grown up with different music that I would have liked, presumably, the different TV shows. I would have had completely different friends. I wouldn't be married to my wife. I'd be presumably married to someone else who I would have had a different kid than I in fact have. And people, they're sort of attached to what their actual life is like in various ways. And if you could have changed everything but only been like slightly better off, most people wouldn't want that. So I mean, that's one thing that Frederick Kaufman says. Now, prudentially, I think that's actually better for you, but that I'm in the minority of philosophers there and biting the bullet on that.
So I mean, the big argument of Lucretius is that, look, he's saying you were deprived of all that time before you came into existence, and that wasn't bad, and now you're going to be deprived of all that time after your death, and that's the same, and so that's also not bad. I mean, there are different ways of putting it, but that's one way of putting it, that he can address a deprivationist and say, look, we have been deprived, and we didn't mind at all that we were deprived of all that time when we didn't exist, and it's all the same. And that's why it's called the mirror argument, because it's mirroring each other. Now,
Right.
there are, I think, two possibly successful answers that we have, of course, and yours is, no, actually, it was bad that we were deprived of that time before we came into existence, right? All those things we missed out by not coming into existence earlier. So we missed the 60s, and we missed the 50s and the 40s, and right.
Well, yes, something like that. I wanted to imagine a world, though, to just sidestep like Frederick Kaufman's concerns. I was imagining a really far away possible world where everything was moved up earlier in objective time, so that if I were born in 1976, but I wanted to have the same friends and family and wife and kid and all of that, then everything happened 10 years earlier in time. So I still get that. That was just to try to sidestep Frederick Kaufman's argument. But yes, I do say, while it's true that the event of any actual person's birth is very likely not bad for them, in the sense that had their birth not occurred, they would have not been born earlier with a longer, better life, it nevertheless is comparably much worse than being born substantially earlier in time and having a longer, better life. Those worlds are very far away, but I want to say that those are perfectly legitimate comparisons to make. And that could be one where only you move up earlier in time and everything else stays the same, so you have different friends and family and you have more well-being. Or it could be everything moves up earlier in time. Any sort of radically far away, implausible scenario, if you do better off in that world, then that world's comparably much better for you, and you can feel bad about not being in that world.
Well, yeah, but I mean, my suspicion is that you would still have to say, well, now we're operating on that, let's say there's universe A and universe B. Now we are in the universe A timeline. And so let's say we were born 1978 on that timeline. Then what it means for us to be born earlier is inside that, let's say it's universe A that came into existence earlier than universe B. Then we say the whole, you're talking about the whole, the Big Bang starting earlier, right? We're talking about the whole thing, right? But so it would seem to me they have to relativize it then to that timeline and say, okay, timeline A, the Big Bang happened a bit earlier and you're in that universe, and then it's 1978, but you could have been born 1968 or 1958, and that would have been better because then you could have enjoyed the 50s and the 60s, all things equal.
But so is the right thing to think about this is in the way of there's this existence space. If you forget about what kind of worlds we're living in and so on, but you can exist. There's a space in which you can exist, and the best thing would be for you to exist in all of that space in time. Is that the correct way to think about it?
Yeah, if that additional space is making your life overall better. I mean, if you would have been, to your point earlier, like, well, you would have been miserable, you would have gotten dysentery, or you would have been, tortured during the Inquisition or something, like, right. Well, no, then that would be better for you. But if we're imagining as a result of this coming into existence earlier, your life is overall better, then yeah, the more net good you have, the better it is for you, and you should want that to happen in faraway worlds where you come into existence earlier just as much as in worlds which you die later.
Can you turn around that argument and ask, should we wait to bring more humans into the world until it gets better? Because then their existence would be measurably better. maybe let's say that we develop super intelligence and everything goes well, and everyone has abundance. Would it be the case that it would be morally right to wait to have more humans in the world before we reach that abundance stage?
This gets into issues about population ethics and views that I have that aren't entailed by deprivationism. They're consistent with it, but you could accept my deprivationist view, for instance, other deprivationist views as well, and then get off the boat for what I say about population ethics. Okay, so I think just as a matter of fact, all of our existences are very modally fragile, which is to say very, very slight differences in the way that the causal events unfold affect who comes into existence. All right, so you came into existence presumably because some fateful night your mom and dad had sex, and the astronomically improbable chances that the one sperm that fertilized the egg that created that zygote that happened, have they done it slightly earlier, slightly later, in a slightly different way, it would have been a different zygote that would come into existence. And the same is true of them, and then of their parents, and of their parents, and so on, back to the origin of life in the universe. So if we wait to increase the population, if we were somehow able to coordinate globally, and then maintain whatever population we need now to try to bring about superintelligence and curb global warming, and then have increase overall life when it could be sustained at a higher level with more advanced technology, we would affect who comes into existence. And we wouldn't be able to. We just don't have the resources, even though it's like metaphysically possible. We just don't have the resources to not bring somebody into existence now and then bring them into existence in the distant future. So if they're going to exist at all, they're going to have to exist at the time that we could create them. And if their life is on the whole good, then I think it's permissible to do, even if waiting would have resulted in different, happier people coming into existence down the line. Now that's a controversial view. Some people with respect to population ethics say what you're morally obligated to do is to bring about the impartially best world, even if that means waiting. And my view is no, if you're doing something wrong, it has to wrong somebody that matters. And you're not wronging anybody if you're giving them a life that's on the whole good. Whereas if you're giving them a life that's on the whole good, and the only alternative available to you is to not give them a life at all, right? If you could like push a button and make someone come into existence with a life at like 50 or a life at 100, and you give them 50, I think that could be wrong because you're harming them, in my view, by doing that. But if your only options are give them a good life or they don't come into existence, then I think it's totally permissible to do, even if it means the world as a whole is less good.
This makes me think of David Benatar down in South Africa, a philosopher who's an antinatalist. So he says by having children, you bring them into this world and they will have pain. By not creating them, you're not depriving them of anything because they are not. There's no one there who can be deprived. So you shouldn't ever bring anyone into existence, no matter how good their lives would be. It's amazing. What do you think about that view?
Right. Well, so I think David is a really brilliant philosopher who is a really original thinker, and he's such a clear writer that it's easy for me to like figure out, okay, here's every sort of like, here's this chain of reasoning, and then like here's the assumptions that I want to take issue with. With respect to that view, so first, I just don't see the, I worry that the asymmetry that he's trying to posit, I worry that that's not coherent. Because he wants to say it is good to prevent a person that has a bad life from coming to existence. He uses the phrase good. He doesn't specify whether it's like intrinsic or extrinsic or morally or prudentially, but he does say it's good to prevent somebody from coming to existence that would have a life that's on the whole bad. But he denies that it's bad to prevent somebody from coming to existence who would have a life that's overall good. And that's his axiological asymmetry. And then the argument that he gives for that is, well, it does a lot of explanatory work.
Can I just give a picture
Please.
that makes that the point? I think Benetton wants to make, I think he also mentions that, and that is, if you have like a planet, you could say, and you say, and there's no one there and no one is suffering, that's good. It's good. There's no one there suffering. There's no pain. But he also doesn't want to say, but we will say, well, but there's no one having fun there either. No one there enjoying anything. And we want to say, well, that's bad, right? And then he wants to say, no, you can't say that unless it's bad for someone, or for someone who's there and not experiencing the what could be experienced as positive. So he wants to say there's an asymmetry. So it's not bad that there's no one there having a decent time, but it is good that there's no one there suffering. Right?
Right. That's exactly right. You put it very nicely. And I just, for reasons that are not original to me, I'm skeptical that that's even a coherent claim to make. I mean, so first off, suppose it's coherent. I don't see any, in principle, reason to posit that asymmetry there. In the explanatory work that he says that it does, in Better Never to Have Been, I think you can do that explanatory work via a different axiology that doesn't posit any asymmetries. And you should think I think antecedently you should think, if you have a coherent axiology that doesn't posit unexplained asymmetries, that does the same explanatory work, then that's the one that you should think is the right one. Now, David would disagree with me about whether it can do the explanatory work, so that's sort of one area where the locus for disagreement lies. But on my view, you can do all the explanatory work that he wants without positing that asymmetry. You just have to do something different. That gets a little complicated. But the other thing is my dissertation advisor, Ben Bradley, wrote a discussion note called Benetton and the Logic of Betterness in the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy. And he argues that that's just not a coherent asymmetry to posit, because goodness and badness are often defined in terms of one another. So if you look at stuff on deontic logic about how to understand these terms formally, it can't make sense of the asymmetry that he wants to posit. So just for instance, like here's a definition of goodness that's widely accepted in deontic logic. Some P is good if and only if P is better than not P. But given that definition, to say that it's good that John experiences some pleasure is just say it's better that John experiences some pleasure than not. So there's a bunch of different sort of ways that you could try to understand how to explicate the concept of goodness and badness and how they relate to one another. And I think what Ben Bradley shows quite convincingly is that every existing way of doing that is not going to even be able to make sense of the asymmetry that David Benatar wants to propose. And maybe there's some coherent way to work it out, but maybe this is a limit of my own cognitive abilities, but I just don't see a coherent way to even understand at a fundamental level this asymmetry that he wants to posit. So I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm skeptical for that reason, because I'm convinced by Ben Bradley's discussion note.
It's also a real deep clash of ways of looking at the world. So for me, one of the most horrible thoughts is there's no conscious experiencing the universe. That is the completely lifeless, consciousnessless universe. That for me is horror. Just horrific if the universe just exists in itself without anyone being able to take it in and reflect on it. So
why is that so horrible?
Yes, exactly. I'm not sure there's more than I can say. I mean, I can just I can talk more about it, but I'm not sure I can give an argument if you don't already feel that way. So I mean, Schopenhauer writes that he wished that this world was like the moon, something without any biological life form. And someone like David Benatar would say, well, there's nothing bad in that because there's no one there suffering, and that's actually good. And the absence of pleasure, well, no one is experiencing the absence of pleasure on that moon, so that's not bad. So it's all good. And for me, That's horrific. Just a complete silent, vacuous universe of things in motion and processes without anyone there to contemplate them, if that's indeed the case. I mean, let's say we are the only conscious thing capable of reflecting on the universe there is. Then we are very important. Then we're the most important thing, I think, in the universe.
A consciousness universe seems to me to be neutral. A universe where the total well-being of all of the creatures that are capable of well-being is in the negative seems to me bad, and where the total well-being of all the creatures that can have well-being is positive, that seems to me good. And the more net positive, the better it is. The more net negative, the worse it is. So, I mean, I that does seem like an intuitive starting point to me. But I also wonder if it's bad to have, in some sense, a life with no conscious experience. I'd want to know how to trade off the amount of goodness of having conscious experience in the universe with the amount of ill-being in that world. So in other words, suppose you have two options. You can have a universe that you create where there's no conscious experience whatsoever, and you say, oh, that sounds so awful. Or you could create a being that's going to have conscious experiences, but they're going to be on the whole bad. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. I want to know, is there any amount at which the conscious experience is on the whole bad for the creature living in that universe, where you'd say it's still better? It's still better to have that being exist and have conscious experiences, even if the life is not good for it, than a universe that's totally lifeless. Okay, so if you say yes, then I worry, that seems counterintuitive to me. And if you say no, well, then it's not clear to me how bad it could be if it's immediately outweighed by even the slightest net negative life.
So I say yes, and then I say, no, I haven't done any calculations on that. I think it's going to be hard to make a principle, but I do think it would be it would just be incredibly impoverished. And so I was going to go back to Lucretius about the argument that he says, look, we were already deprived of all those days before we came into existence, and that wasn't bad, and now we're going to be deprived again, and that's going to be the same thing, and so that's not bad either. And then the psychological argument is that we don't fear the time before we were born, that we missed out on that, so we shouldn't fear the time after. And you say, well, intrinsically we shouldn't fear the state of not existing anymore. Travis, you say, and yeah, because that's not terrible. So I think that there are two good solutions, and not two good solutions. I'm not sure I buy, Travis, your solution. Your solution is that we should both kind of regret not having been born earlier and regret not continuing, or see it as a bad thing. But then I think the standard view is rather to say, as Peter's intuition was, that, look, we could not have come into existence earlier, so there's nothing there to miss. There's nothing there. We're not deprived of anything, because metaphysically, anything that was born 20 years earlier or a significant amount of time earlier would just be another person. It wouldn't be me being born earlier, something like that. So, but I think that the strength here is that we have two answers. I mean, I'm partial to one of them, the impossibility, but if that doesn't fly, we have your argument that, yeah, there is a symmetry. It's both bad to be deprived of the prenatal time and the post-mortem time.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Fair summary.
Yes, although I do wonder how you would draw the relevant line of possibility to say that it's impossible to be born substantially earlier in the relevant sense, but not die later. Because you seem very, like me, permissive about the worlds you could go to live a longer life as a result of not dying. And if you were that permissive, it seems like that level of permissibility would say that it is possible to be born substantially earlier in time.
It could be that I haven't gotten used to your way of dealing with the possibility by saying that the Big Bang started earlier, I'm a bit suspicious that it's going to be very hard to derive intuition from a case like that. I mean, just time itself. How do we think of time here? And so,
Yeah.
and so when I say, well, I'm confining myself to the the world that was created at the time it was created, and then I imagine a few years back, and then I get the problems that you pointed out, that if psychology or personality is what grounds our personal identity, then if I was born in the 50s, it wouldn't be me. It would just be somebody completely different. And if it's the body, you talk about the zygote and the sperm, it probably would be different too, and so on, right? That I just find thinking through the details just makes me feel that it's impossible, along the lines that you yourself described.
Yeah. Well, so when you say impossible, do you mean metaphysically impossible, but not logically impossible? Because you could imagine yourself existing earlier without contradiction.
Yeah, but I don't think so. If you think of it very closely, I think you can say it. I mean, logically, in the sense logically that it's not a contradiction of language to say I could have been born in the 50s or something like that. But I think thinking it through, I think it reveals that what we say really is a metaphysical impossibility.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That is a fascinating space. I mean, this is very difficult things to talk about, for sure.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Let me ask one more question about this, if that's okay. So
Yeah.
that could be right. There are certain things that are epistemic possibilities, and one of those epistemic possibilities is that modal collapse is true, which is to say that the actual world is the only possible world. And if it turns out, like if we were to discover that modal collapse is true, say, we discover God exists and his nature is determined such that he would only actualize this world. Or the world that he actualizes is like all possibilities of every combination of different sentient life or something like that. So, and he would have never done his nature necessitates that he wouldn't do anything differently. If I were to discover that, or we were to discover that, and some being had a life that's on the whole bad for it, I would still think, well, it's fitting to lament not existing in a world where they did better, even if it's impossible. Even if it's impossible for them to die later, even if it's impossible for them to not suffer so horribly in the actual world. Now, maybe you think that's cheating, because we don't have good evidence that the actual world is the only possible world. But that does seem, it's epistemically possible in the sense that we could imagine we discover such an evidence in the future. Philosophers have made arguments for that.
Yeah.
And I want to know, how should I feel in that case? And in that case, I would still think, well, I would just say that the metaphysical possibility is not relevant here. I would even go to counter possible worlds to make some comparisons that I think would generate fitting attitudes.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that intuition that you say, even if the world is deterministic, and nothing really could have been different, and his life really couldn't have been any better than it was.
Yeah.
And anything we imagine is actually false. It's false that it could have been better. It couldn't have been better. The world is deterministic. Everything is what it is. We still want to be able to say, yeah, it's still terrible that it went the way it went. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, right. And I mean, not just deterministic, but like deterministic and the starting points was the same. Like the initial conditions combined with the deterministic laws, none of those things had been, not just the deterministic laws couldn't have been different, but the initial starting point could have been different. This is the only possible world. Still, I think beings that suffer, that have net negative lives, can justifiably lament not existing in another world, even if it's a counter possible world, even if it's an impossible world. where they fared much better. And if I'm being that permissive about these other bads, I don't, for myself, see an in principle way to sort of rule off the, fantastical case where you're born substantially earlier in time.
It's just that, when I get into the details, who are the parents here, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I just end up the conclusion this is just a different person. But these are hard.
Yeah. But what about a case where it's metaphysically necessary that a person exists with chronic pain that makes their life bad because it's a result of a genetic condition, and they couldn't have come into existence with a different sperm and egg combination with different fundamental physical laws that cause them to come into existence? So I just think you couldn't. There's no way to change what the actual world is like that is going to result in them that person existing and not being in chronic pain.
So you're saying
it's bad for them.
So you're saying even if it would be metaphysically impossible to come into existence earlier, it still would have been better. That I would have to accept that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't presume to tell you what you have to accept, but I'm just trying to explain what has pushed me into this position that seems so radically counterintuitive and so wild. It's that sort of consideration that pushed me that far into this pretty radical direction. This is why something that seems as, intuitively clear as deprivationism, when you first describe it, you really start to think through all of the commitments that you have to take on, like any philosophical view, proves to be very, very puzzling and surprising in a variety of ways. And you come across various choice points where you have to say something that you would have never imagined would be plausibly true. And I think that's just one of the things that's valuable about what analytic philosophers do, is reasoning in this way at this level of depth and thinking through these possibilities reveals these logical connections between various starting points that you want and other things that you want to say. And that's very, I think that's very valuable. It's valuable to weed out contradictions. It's valuable to realize the limits of your own knowledge. It's valuable to think about implications of views that you would have never thought about before that can change not only how you should act, but how you should, what you should believe. And I think what you should believe matters just as much, or I don't know if I actually think that, but what you believe matters too. I care about having true, justified beliefs.
I mean, it's all these notions and concepts that we say, well, this is good enough in an everyday setting. And then the philosopher goes home and he can't let go. And he's like, wait,
right. Exactly.
This is not good enough. I'm not satisfied. Because if I believe this, then what about this? And so on. But I mean, it's a good thing.
You guys have a hard time.
It's a good thing to still, you have a feeling that you're on the right track when you say deprivationism. And then now you're sorting out the details of it. And so this is very good. I don't just think death is bad. Here's my argument, or here are my reasons. This is what I mean by death is bad, and these are some of the wrinkles, and I've sorted them out. And yeah,
right, exactly.
Wow, that was almost 2 hours.
That flew by.
Yeah.
For me, anyway.
Yeah,
I
no, absolutely.
Yeah, same here.
So what else are you working on, or do you want to tell us about?
Well, I'm working on a monograph right now on death, and I have a complete version of it, and I've just working on revisions before I send it off to the publisher. So that's like my big project. I'm being very precious about it. I should have sent it off months ago, but I want to get everything right, or as right as I possibly could, before I send it out. I work on something in ethics called the actualism possibilism debate, which concerns the relationship between our free actions and our moral obligations. So you might wonder whether, when you're deciding what to do, you should hold fixed facts about the free choices that you would make in the future or not. And actualists say yes, and possibilists say no. That's rather abstract, but the case that illustrates it goes back to Holly Smith, called Professor Procrastinate, where suppose Professor Procrastinate gets an invitation to write a review of a book, and she can accept or decline the invitation now. Whatever you think is required for free will, if you think it's possible, suppose that those conditions are met to accept or decline the invitation. And then later, when the time comes to write the book review, suppose that those conditions are met to either write or not write the review. But suppose it's also in fact true that if Procrastinate accepts, when the time comes to write it, she will freely not choose, or is overwhelmingly likely to freely not choose to not write the book review. And that'd be the worst outcome. The second best outcome is just decline, and the best outcome is to accept and write. So the debate concerns like, well, when you're deciding whether you should accept, do you take into account the fact that you would not write if you accept, or do you ignore that when you're determining what your obligation is? So I'm working on a paper about that debate where you combine what seem like very plausible decision theoretic procedures with different views in the debate to try to shed light on whether you should be actualist or possibilist or some variant of those two. So book project that, and then a paper that I'm working on the procreation asymmetry, which we sort of touched on, where most people think that it is permissible to refrain from creating a life that would be on the whole good, even if one can cautiously do so, but impermissible to create a life that would be on the whole bad, even if you can cautiously do so. And there's a question about how to even make sense of those judgments. If there's moral reason to not cause somebody to live net bad lives, presumably there's moral reason to cause somebody to live net good lives. So why could you have an obligation to prevent bad lives, but not an obligation to create happy lives? And I have a paper where I try to justify the asymmetry at a deontic level, but not the moral reasons level, which I say there's moral reasons to do both, but they're different in the type of reasons that they are, such that it's always permissible to not create happy lives, everything else equal, but impermissible to create bad lives.
Be careful that you don't help the antinatalist there.
Yes. Well, that is really good that you say that, because a lot of standard solutions to the procreation asymmetry actually inadvertently generate antinatalism. And I think a feature of the solution that I defend is that it avoids the antinatalist conclusion. Because if you say something like, well, there's no moral reason to create happy lives, but there is moral reason to not create bad lives, well, then it looks like you've just generated antinatalism in the actual world, because in creating a life, you're going to affect the trajectory of many, 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 many lives, some of which will probably be on the whole bad. So like, even if like my wife and I are deciding to have a second kid, for instance, even if we justifiably believe that that second child's life would be on the whole good, what are the consequences of that action? Well, if our kid has a kid and we become grandparents, and then they have kids and they have kids, which most people do, it's actually many, many generations of lives. But also because of the modal fragility that we talked about earlier, the way that they're going to interact with the world is going to cause all sorts of people to come into existence just through sort of mundane interactions. They cause someone to get home 5 minutes later, and then that affects when that couple has a kid, and that affects who comes in existence. So if there's moral reason to not create bad lives, but there's no moral reason to create good lives, then it looks like it's impermissible to create life at all, because we would be failing to act on the moral reason to avoid creating bad lives. And I take that to be a wildly implausible conclusion that we should avoid if we can.
I should have forewarned you, but we usually ask our guests about a couple of books, 3 books or so, perhaps a movie that that's meant something to them or that they would recommend.
I mean, off the top of my head, since we were talking about death, Ben Bradley's book, Well-Being in Death, was the one that I read that made me pursue graduate school at Syracuse University, where he would serve as my dissertation advisor. That's what got me interested in the topic. So not only is that a phenomenal book, but it's personally meaningful to me because it so drastically shaped the direction of my life. I knew I wanted to do philosophy then. I thought maybe ethics or philosophy of mind or There's lots of fields that I liked, and this is what this just captured my imagination in a way that totally changed what my focus was on and what I've done so in the 15 years since. So that's one. You mentioned a movie. There's a cartoon film by Don Hertzfeldt called "It's Such a Beautiful Day." That's really like 15 to 20-minute short films about a character that deals with philosophical themes related to life and death and immortality that almost nobody has seen because it was a small independent feature. But it wrestles with these questions in a way that's really insightful and I think philosophically astute, and does it through the medium of a story that I think is that I personally find very poignant. It's a stick figure in the animation, and he makes you feel deep emotions for what the stick figure is dealing with, partly because of the universal themes. And I love that film. I show it to students sometimes in my philosophy of death class, and they all hate it. So take that, because it's an experimental, weird, bizarre type of film in a way, but it's totally unique. So that personally means a lot to me. I'll say one more. I think because you said three. Henry Sidgwick's The Method of Ethics was something that I read as an undergraduate that I found just an incredible work of moral philosophy that raised a bunch of issues that we're still working on today, and he wrote with such clarity and depth I just think it's like a masterful philosophical work. I mean, there's lots of them out there, but that's one that I had read as an undergraduate that also played a sort of pivotal role in my own philosophical interests.
Thank you.
A lot of people think he's dry and boring, so I don't know, but I like it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.